Welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to completely deconstruct the heavily romanticized myth of the Silk Road.
It is a massive myth, honestly.
It really is. We are going to reveal the incredibly complex, chaotic, and just fascinating web of global trade that actually laid the groundwork for the modern world.
Right. The stuff they don't teach you in school.
Exactly. And to do this, we are drawing from a comprehensive compilation of historical data, research notes, and the incredibly detailed Wikipedia archives on the subject. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Usually when you picture the Silk Road, you probably imagine a very specific, almost cinematic map. You picture a single winding dirt path stretching neatly from some palace in ancient China all the way across the harsh desert and ending perfectly at the marble steps of the Roman Senate.
Right, with a continuous line of camels.
Yes, camels loaded entirely with shimmering silk. Well, prepare to have that map completely shattered, because the sources drop a bombshell right out of the gate.
A few of them, actually.
Yeah. The Silk Road was not a single road. It wasn't just about silk. And the people who actually lived during its peak, even famous travelers like Marco Polo, never once used the term.
It's a profound historical irony, really.
It is.
Because the popular imagination has totally smoothed over the gritty, decentralized reality of this network. And for anyone listening who is navigating today's hyper-connected globalized economy, understanding this ancient web is essentially the ultimate cheat code.
Oh, absolutely.
It helps you grasp the underlying mechanics of how human cultures, global economies, and even microscopic diseases have been colliding and shaping our world for millennia. I mean, it wasn't a neatly paved trade route. It was the sprawling, unregulated central nervous system of the ancient world.
I really love that framing, a central nervous system. So if the merchants who actually bled and died on these routes didn't call it the Silk Road, where did that branding even come from?
Well, it's surprisingly modern.
Really? Because it feels like a foundational, ancient concept.
Right, but the term Seidenstrasse, which is German for Silk Road, was actually coined in 1877.
Wait, 1877?
Yeah, by a geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen. Before the late 19th century, there was no singular name for this vast network.
That is wild.
And modern scholars, like Warwick Ball, push back heavily on the term. Ball actually calls the entire concept of a coherent overland Silk Road a myth of modern academia.
A myth. Wow.
Yeah, he argues that the maritime spice trade with India and Arabia was infinitely more critical to the Roman economy than overland Chinese silk ever was.
That completely makes me rethink the whole tone line. If the name is basically just a Victorian invention, we are forcing a modern label onto ancient history.
We really are.
And the origins don't even involve silk. The sources say the southern stretches of these routes leading from places like Khotan into eastern China were active as early as 5000 BCE.
Right, long before silk was the main export.
Exactly. They weren't trading textiles, they were trading jade. So, yeah. Calling this massive multi-continental exchange of goods the Silk Road is kind of like looking at the entire modern internet and calling it the cat video highway.
That's a perfect analogy.
Right. Sure, the cat videos are there, they are highly popular, but it completely misses the underlying infrastructure.
What's fascinating here is the geopolitical strategy that actually built that infrastructure.
Yeah.
Because this network, it wasn't born out of a desire to establish a free market textile exchange.
It wasn't.
No, it was born out of raw military necessity. If we look at the Chinese Han Dynasty around 130 BCE, Emperor Wu was facing this localized existential threat.
The northern tribes, right?
Exactly. Constant devastating raids from the nomadic Xiongnu tribes of the northern steppes.
Right, and you can't really fight a highly mobile nomadic cavalry with standard slow-moving agricultural infantry. The Han army was just getting completely outmaneuvered.
Utterly outmaneuvered. So Emperor Wu didn't look west to open a trade route. He looked west for military technology.
Oh, I see.
He dispatched an envoy named Zhang Qian to venture into the really dangerous, unknown Western territories to find allies. But more importantly, Zhang Qian was tasked with securing heavenly horses.
Heavenly horses? That sounds totally mythological. What were they actually looking for?
They were looking for tall, powerful war horses from the Daeoan region, which, funnily enough, was essentially a leftover Greek kingdom in Central Asia.
Wait, a Greek kingdom in China?
Central Asia, yeah.
Yeah.
Established by the conquests of Alexander the Great.
Oh, wow.
And the Chinese cavalry desperately needed these superior mounts to match the speed and power of the Xiongnu nomads. The Han Dynasty even fought a massive conflict known as the War of the Heavenly Horses just to secure the breeding stock.
Just for the horses?
Just for the horses. So the initial thrust westward, the massive extension of the Great Wall, the construction of watchtowers and military garrisons, all of it was designed to secure borders and transport military assets.
So the trade was just an accident.
Yeah, the fact that opportunistic merchants started trailing behind these military patrols to hawk their goods was entirely a byproduct of Han Dynasty defense spending.
That completely flips the script. It's like how the modern internet was originally developed by DARPA for military communication, and then it eventually got commercialized. Trade was literally a side effect of military logistics.
Exactly.
Okay, so Han Dynasty secures these western corridors, but let's talk about the physical reality of moving the goods. Because you mentioned Ball pointing out the importance of maritime trade. I really feel like the ocean routes are the forgotten stepchild of this whole Silk Road story.
Oh, they absolutely are, which is a massive oversight. Long before Chinese junks dominated the eastern seas, the maritime routes were established and mastered by Austronesian sailors.
Out of Southeast Asia, right.
Right, and we are talking about incredible feats of ancient engineering here. They used sewn plank ships to cross the Indian Ocean.
Hold on, sewn plank, as in they didn't use iron nails? How does a ship stitched together with rope survive a monsoon?
Well, that is the genius of it. They used coconut fiber rope to stitch the wooden planks together.
You're kidding, coconut fiber.
Seriously. And unlike a rigid nailed hull that might just splinter under the immense stress of a massive ocean swell, a sewn plank ship has flex. It absorbs the shock of the waves.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, these sailors mastered the monsoon wind patterns, creating this massive, reliable maritime highway connecting Southeast Asia to India, the Arabian Peninsula, and East Africa.
That's incredible.
And economically, maritime travel was vastly superior. Moving bulk goods by sea was roughly a fifth of the cost of overland transport.
A fifth?
Yeah, I mean, a camel can carry a few hundred pounds, a sewn plank ship can carry tons.
But let's look at the overland route for a second, because the logistics there just boggle my mind. We established that nobody is walking from Beijing to Rome. Marco Polo is an extreme outlier, and that's centuries later. This was what, a relay race?
A highly decentralized relay trade.
Yeah.
The true masters of the overland route weren't the Chinese or the Romans. They were middlemen. Specifically, groups like the Sogdians, an Eastern Iranian people who operated out of desert oases like Samarkand.
Right.
They would buy goods from a Chinese merchant at the border, carry them across a brutal stretch of the Taklamakan Desert, sell them to an Indian or Persian merchant at the next oasis, and then just go home.
So a single bolt of silk might change hands, like, dozens of times before reaching the Mediterranean.
Dozens of times, easily.
See, this is where I have to push back on the economics of it all.
Okay, lay it on.
If this is essentially a massive continent-spanning chain of ancient dropshippers, and the goods are changing hands 20 times, every single middleman is adding a markup, right?
Oh, absolutely. To justify the lethal risk of crossing a desert.
Right. So how does the math not break? By the time a bolt of silk reaches Rome, the price should be infinity. How did the Romans end up importing enough of this stuff to trigger an economic crisis?
Well, the math does break, but the demand was completely inelastic. Wealthy Romans had an insatiable appetite for this exotic luxury.
It was a status thing.
Pure status. The scarcity only fueled the symbol. It's like ancient ticket scalping. The price is irrelevant if the buyer wants to show off their wealth. And the funniest part is, the Romans barely understood what they were even buying.
Wait, what do you mean?
The poet Virgil actually wrote that silk was harvested by combing the fuzz off of tree leaves in the East.
No way. They thought it grew on trees.
They literally thought it was tree fuzz.
They were bankrupting their entire empire for tree fuzz. But seriously, if the markup is that high, it drains the economy, right?
Which is exactly what caused a massive panic in the Roman Senate. You have Pliny the Elder and other senators complaining bitterly that Rome was bleeding its gold and silver reserves eastward just to pay for this fabric.
Wow.
They tried to issue edicts banning it, but the protectionism failed spectacularly. People just wanted it too much.
Of course.
And it also triggered this massive moral panic. Seneca the Younger, the prominent Stoic philosopher, publicly complained that women wearing see-through silk dresses were ruining traditional Roman decency.
Oh, classic.
Yeah, so it was this dual crisis. Bleeding bullion and bleeding morals.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because when one empire is bleeding its gold reserves to pay another empire for a monopoly product, that dynamic never lasts peacefully.
No, it does not.
You don't just get a trade deficit, you get state-sponsored espionage. The lengths the Byzantine Empire went to in order to break this monopoly are just staggering.
It is genuinely an ancient covert operation. By the 6th century, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian was desperate.
Right, because the Western Roman Empire had fallen by then.
Exactly. The East was trying to hold on, and they were paying these exorbitant, extortive prices to Persian middlemen for silk. Justinian just couldn't afford it anymore.
So what did he do?
He recruited 2 Nestorian Christian monks who had traveled east. Their mission was to bypass the Persian blockade, infiltrate Chinese territory, and steal the closely guarded secret of silk production.
It's the ancient equivalent of sneaking into a major tech giant's headquarters to steal the source code for their microchips. And the execution of it was brilliant. How did they actually get the silkworms out without being executed on the spot?
It's so clever. They hollowed out their bamboo walking canes,
Wow.
and they carefully hid live silkworm eggs and mulberry seeds inside, because the worms only eat mulberry leaves, right?
Right.
They hid them inside the canes and literally walked all the way back to Constantinople.
That is insane.
That single act of industrial espionage completely broke the Chinese monopoly. The Byzantines established their own silk industry right there in the Mediterranean.
But that has to create a massive ripple effect, right? I mean, if the Byzantines are suddenly making their own silk, the Chinese economy has to take a massive hit. They just lost their biggest, most lucrative client.
Precisely. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, you see how deeply interconnected global politics were, even back then. With the Western monopoly broken, China couldn't rely on a passive flow of Roman gold.
So they had to pivot.
They had to pivot hard. This economic pressure is a major factor leading into the Tang dynasty in the 7th century. The Tang rulers realized they needed to actively secure and expand new markets in Central Asia.
They couldn't just sit back anymore.
Exactly. So they pushed westward with incredible military force, subduing the nomadic Turkic tribes and establishing the Pax Sinica, or Chinese peace.
They essentially forced the trade routes back open under their own military umbrella.
Yes, and it sparked a massive golden age. Because the Tang secured the route so effectively, urban centers like Chang'an became the most cosmopolitan cities on Earth.
Oh, I've read about this.
Yeah, you had Persian merchants, Indian monks, and Arabian envoys all living together in Chinese cities. But as you mentioned earlier, the military edge of the empires pushing against each other created some violent friction.
Right. It wasn't all just peaceful merchants exchanging ideas in tea houses. We have to talk about the Battle of Sogdiana in 36 BCE. This entirely blows my mind.
It's a crazy moment in history.
The Han Chinese military actually clashed with Roman legionaries in Central Asia. And the sources say they were likely mercenaries, or maybe survivors from the disastrous campaign of the Roman general Crassus, who were captured and forced to fight for the Xiongnu.
It perfectly illustrates the insane reach of these empires. The Chinese historical records describe the enemy troops using a fish scale formation.
Which scholars heavily suspect was the famous Roman testudo, right? The shield wall.
Exactly.
Just picture that culture clash. A highly disciplined Roman shield wall, locking their heavy scutum shields together, suddenly facing Han Dynasty mechanical crossbows.
And it did not go well for the Romans.
No. The crossbows tore them apart. The mechanics of the Chinese trigger mechanisms allowed them to store far more kinetic energy than a hand-drawn bow. They were firing heavy bolts that easily pierced the Roman armor.
It's a really stark reminder that military technology moved just as fast as luxury goods across these routes.
Absolutely.
But, as fascinating as the crossbows and the smuggled silkworms are, physical commodities were really only half the story.
Oh, for sure.
The physical infrastructure, the roads, the sea lanes, the caravans, they paved the way for an invisible cargo that fundamentally altered human history.
Yes, the god and germ exchange. Let's look at religion first. The transmission of Buddhism is incredible because it wasn't just a spiritual awakening. It was deeply, deeply tied to economics.
Right. Buddhism was arguably the first truly large-scale missionary movement in world history. But the monks didn't just walk into the desert hoping for the best.
No, they had a system.
By the 5th and 6th centuries, Buddhism had found a highly receptive audience among the merchant class. The merchants actually funded the construction of massive Buddhist monasteries along the harsh desert trade routes.
Why the merchants, though? Was it just out of piety?
Well, partially, but it was incredibly practical. These monasteries functioned as the ancient equivalent of venture capital banks and secure motels.
I loved that.
If you are crossing a lethal stretch of the Taklamakan Desert, a fortified monastery provides fresh water, a safe haven from bandits, and a place to securely store your goods. The monasteries even operated mills and presses.
So in return for donations, the monks provided economic infrastructure.
Exactly. And as the merchants hopped from oasis to oasis, utilizing this infrastructure, they carried the religious texts and teachings from India through Central Asia and deep into China and eventually all the way to Japan.
And as it moved, it mutated. The artistic syncretism is like a multi-generational game of cultural telephone.
That's a great way to put it.
You have the Greek conquest of Alexander the Great leaving behind Hellenistic artistic traditions in Central Asia, right? So, over centuries, a Greek statue of Hercules holding a club slowly evolves in the hands of different cultures until he becomes Vajrapani.
The protector of the Buddha.
Exactly. Or take the Greek wind god, Boreas. That visual concept travels east, gets adapted by local artisans, and eventually crosses the sea to become Fujin, the Japanese Shinto wind god.
It's amazing.
Even the way we universally picture the Buddha today, in human form wearing flowing robes, was initially heavily influenced by the realism of Greek sculpture blending with Indian spirituality in the Gandhara region.
See, this is what forces us to redefine who actually drives human progress. We always focus on the massive, settled empires with their written laws and their marble capitals.
Or by the Romans, the Han.
But the true engine of this cultural synthesis was nomadic mobility. The people who lived on the steppes. For example, the Chinese and the Xiongnu nomads were sworn enemies, but they engaged in constant deep cultural exchange.
Really? Like what?
Well, the Xiongnu adopted Chinese agricultural techniques to survive harsh winters, while the Chinese adopted Xiongnu cavalry tactics, tailored trousers for riding, which is a huge innovation, and even steppe music.
So the empires built the walls, but the nomads stitched the world together.
Exactly. Beautifully said.
But that stitching together had a catastrophic dark side, too. The same network that allowed a Greek artistic concept to reach Japan also provided a biological highway for the Black Death.
Yeah, the interconnectedness was a massive double-edged sword. Research strongly indicates that the plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, originated in the marmot populations of Central Asia.
And the mechanics of the transmission are just terrifyingly efficient.
They really are. The bacteria basically blocks the gut of the flea. So the starving flea becomes frantic, biting anything it can find.
Including the humans and pack animals operating the caravans?
Exact.
So a completely localized disease suddenly gets a free ride across the entire continent.
Right. And one of the most prominent theories points to the Genoese traders as the vector to Europe.
The Italian merchants.
Yes. They were operating out of a heavily fortified trading post called Kaffa, right on the Black Sea in modern-day Crimea. In the 1340s, they interacted with infected Silk Road caravans. And when a localized war broke out and the Mongols laid siege to Kaffa, the disease entered the city.
Oh, no.
The Genoese merchants fled onto their ships, sailed back to Italy, and unwittingly carried the plague directly into the heart of Western Europe.
Wiping out up to half the population.
Yeah.
It is such a chilling parallel to modern supply chains. I mean, we saw during recent pandemics how a localized outbreak can halt global manufacturing in days. The ancient world was just as vulnerable to supply chain contagion.
Completely.
But to understand how a flea from Central Asia could smoothly make it all the way to a ship in the Black Sea, we really have to talk about the political climax of the Silk Road, the era that made that level of integration possible in the first place, the Mongol Empire.
Yes. The 13th and 14th centuries under the Mongols represent the absolute zenith of overland integration in Eurasia.
Because they conquered everything.
Pretty much. When Genghis Khan and his successors conquered nearly the entire landmass from China to Eastern Europe, they created something unprecedented, political uniformity across the trade routes. We call it the Pax Mongolica.
But how do you even police a 4,000-mile desert highway?
Through sheer organizational ruthlessness, the Mongols implemented the Yam system. It was a continent-wide network of relay stations spaced about a day's ride apart.
Oh, like the Pony Express.
It was exactly the ancient Pony Express. A rider could swap out a tired horse for a fresh one and cover 200 miles in a single day.
That is incredibly fast for that era.
It was. And they also introduced the peza, which was essentially an ancient VIP passport. A merchant carrying a gold or silver tablet from the Khan was guaranteed safe passage and access to the relay stations.
So for the first time in history, you didn't have to deal with 50 different local warlords taxing you to death at every border.
Exactly.
This is the golden era everyone knows.
Yeah.
This is the infrastructure that allowed a Venetian merchant named Marco Polo to actually survive the journey from Europe to the court of Kublai Khan in China.
Right, the YAM system made that possible.
But the travel wasn't just west to east, which I think is a common misconception.
Yeah.
The sources mention Rabban Bar Sama, a Uyghur monk born in Beijing. He did the exact reverse.
He did, yeah.
He traveled from China all the way to Europe, meeting with the Pope, the King of France, and the King of England. The world was just shrinking.
And the wealth generated by this integration was staggering. Look at the Turco-Mongol ruler Timur in the late 14th century. He conquered vast territories and forcibly relocated the greatest artisans, architects, and intellectuals from across the Islamic world to his capital in Samarkand.
In modern Uzbekistan.
Right. He funneled the wealth of the Silk Road into creating an absolute powerhouse of culture, building these massive monuments covered in brilliant blue tiles that still stand today.
But as always, empires fall. And when the Mongol grip loosened, the entire system just unraveled.
It did.
And it wasn't because consumers in Europe suddenly lost their taste for spices or silk.
No, it raises a really important question. What happens to a globalized economy when the central trust network collapses?
Everything breaks.
Exactly. The decline of the Silk Road was a brutal, perfect storm. First, the Mongol Empire fragmented into competing khanates, destroying that safe, unified passport system.
Right.
Second, the Black Death ravaged the populations and economies of the connected hubs. And finally, the fatal blow, the rise of the Ottoman Empire.
Right, because geography is destiny. The Ottomans take Constantinople in 1453, and they sit right on the hinge between Europe and Asia.
Exactly. And the Ottomans were equipped with advanced gunpowder technology. They systematically conquered and locked down the western termini of the overland routes.
So they just shut the door.
They heavily taxed or outright blocked European access to all those Asian luxuries they had been addicted to for centuries.
Wait, let me connect these dots here. The Ottomans erect a massive geopolitical toll booth. Europe is completely cut off from the east. So the entire age of discovery, Columbus, Vasco da Gama, the massive fleets of galleons, was just Europe desperately trying to find a workaround.
That is the grand irony of global history. The death of the overland Silk Road violently birthed the era of European ocean exploration.
Wow.
They couldn't go through the Ottomans, so they decided to sail around Africa or sail west across the Atlantic. The collapse of an ancient land network directly triggered modern maritime colonialism and the intensification of globalization as we know it today.
So what does this all mean? We sit here today, tapping our screens, ordering electronics from Shenzhen and avocados from Mexico. We think of globalization as a purely modern invention, a miracle of container ships, algorithms, and fiber optic cables.
But it's not.
No. This deep dive proves that we are not the first. For thousands of years, our ancestors were just as obsessed with foreign luxuries, just as vulnerable to the rapid spread of global pandemics, and just as deeply, fundamentally interconnected.
Absolutely. And, there's one final thought we should really pull from the sources here to kind of chew on.
Let's hear it.
We spent this time discussing history, right? And history is almost always written by settled, literate empires. The Romans, the Han Dynasty, the ones who built the massive cities.
Sure, they leave the records.
Right. But the tree architects of this ancient global web were the nomadic tribes.
The Scythians, the Xiongnu.
Exactly. The people who bred the horses, who guided the caravans across the deserts, and who protected, or, taxed the routes. So consider this. What if the greatest leaps in human progress weren't driven by the people who built massive city walls, but by the people who never had a permanent home at all?
That is a brilliant question to end on. The next time you picture that cinematic map with the neat single line stretching across the world, remember the reality. The line wasn't drawn by a master planner. It was drawn by millions of footprints in the dust, constantly moving, constantly adapting, and quietly changing the world.